think I have, for the most part, everything together now. Are you guys ready on your end?
Yeah, I'm going to grab my remote here and mute it just in case there's any noise there. We'll prevent that from happening. I'm ready. Speak to us.
Okay, thank you. All right, so my name's Christopher Hellman. Today we're going to be talking about why Alexander the Great's speech, Mutiny of Opus, was better than Socrates' apology. Now, it was really specific why I chose these two to compare, because one, in many characteristics that I don't think I'll have time to get into, Socrates and Alexander the Great were pretty comparable in kind of how they thought about themselves. They both were very self-fulfilled. Secondly, they were both Greek, and they both somehow ended up in like a very similar situation where they had a large population of people committing mutiny and going against them. So to start off, let's talk about Socrates and what even happened there. Why at the age of 70 is this man making his first appearance in court? So first off, he died at 70, 399 BC. For perspective, this is 300 years before Christ was even alive. So we're talking 2,400 years ago. Secondly, he had a couple disciples, being Plato. Plato was a teacher of Aristotle, and then Aristotle was the teacher or mentor of Alexander the Great. Now, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great about medicine, philosophy, morals, religion, and logic, art as well. Something I find kind of humorous is that Alexander the Great liked the work of Homer. He had three of the greatest thinkers pretty much at his direct disposal, but he liked the work of Homer the most. Some jokes just simply write themselves. Now, what happened? How did Socrates go from being a well-renowned public figure to facing the death penalty in court in Athens? Well, it started by one of his friends seeking to go and speak to the oracle. Now, back then, in these times, the oracle was a religious figure. They thought the oracle was able to speak the words of God. It was generally a woman. One of Socrates' friends voyages to go speak to the oracle. He asked the oracle, he's like, "Is there anybody wiser than Socrates?" The oracle said no. This word gets back to Socrates, and Socrates hears that nobody's wiser than him, and he's like, how could this be true? Because I'm not wise. So even at his old age, as he's in his 60s at this point, he voyages all the way out to this oracle, and this depleted what little funds that he had, as he never amassed a lot of wealth because he gave most everything he had for free. So he voyages to this oracle, and he asks this oracle, he's like, "Is Socrates the wisest of them all?" And the oracle says, "Yes," again. And he's like, "This can't be true. This cannot be true, because I am not wise." So he's like, "Well, I must go and find out what the gods mean by this." So in this process, Socrates decides, I'm going to go speak to people who I think are wiser than me. And then I'll be able to go back to this oracle with this information and ask why. So this is where he starts speaking to politicians, poets, and artisans. Most notably, though, that we're going to talk about the most is the politicians. So Socrates starts going and talking to these politicians. And he's asking them questions about life, questions about morals, deep philosophical questions. And it becomes like this mass ordeal as young men started flocking to come watch Socrates grill these politicians. Because what he found was that these politicians weren't wise. If anything, they knew a lot about one subject, but then proclaimed to know a lot about everything. And he was grilling them somewhat publicly, even though unintentionally. And this caused a lot of outrage by these politicians because they were being publicly exposed. This is where Socrates started amassing a lot of enemies. And then he rinsed and lathered this process with the poets and the artisans. He did the same thing with both these groups of people. And this eventually resulted at the age of 70, Socrates makes his first court appearance facing the death penalty. Meletus claimed that Socrates didn't believe in the gods and that he was corrupting the youth. These were the two main charges brought up against Socrates. Now, in Socrates' court appearance, which he defended himself for about an hour and a half, in the beginning he states, "I don't know the lingo of how we're supposed to speak in court, so bear with me. I only speak the truth." And what he proceeds to do is he spends the majority of his time intellectually cornering his accuser by forcing his accuser into inaccurate statements, proving his accuser's accusations wrong. And he does this for quite a long period of time. He gets his accuser to pretty much admit that he does believe in the gods, and a lot of the reason why he is here is because he believes in the gods, because he went on this massive journey of the oracle. He rattles off about a half a dozen people who he personally taught, such as Plato's brother was the one in attendance, not Plato himself. That's a bit of an inaccuracy that I've noticed in some of the research. And several other people he rattles off, and he's like, if I am such a bad impression on the youth, why are these people who have worked with me the closest independently not here to testify against me, but here in support of me? You can call upon them to the stands, but you don't, because you know they're in support of me. Now, this goes on to vote, and Socrates loses by 12 votes, so he's again facing the death penalty. Now, this time, you're allowed to propose what you think is fair for your penalty. And Socrates, not backing down, says, well, I've been unjustly put up here as committing no crime, and I expected to lose. He talks about how his whole life he's had this voice in the back of his head, and it never tells him what to do, but it always tells him what not to do. Because he had the option to flee. He had enough time between his court appearance to flee, and he wanted to, but this voice said don't, and he doesn't go against this voice. And he says this to the court. And he says, it's impossible for a man of lesser to harm a man of better, because killing him does more wrong than good, and it will be wrong in the eyes of the gods. What he's saying is that I contribute so much to society, it doesn't matter if you kill me, because you're only hurting yourself more, because you will not find a replacement from me. In part of this speech, he states that he's like, I am a gift from God. Literally what he says. He says, I am a gift from God. Although he talks about how he knows nothing and he gives everything for free, this is where we get to see kind of like this multifaceted personality where it's like he believes he's a gift from God, but at the same time also believes he knows nothing. Which is similar to Alexander the Great. Now, in this, he also proposes that I have no money, I am in poverty, but people such as Plato are offering 30 Athens for my freeing. He's like, I can't provide this, but I have people vouching to say that they'll pay it. The court decides against it. They give Socrates the death penalty. Now, Alexander the Great, prior to this speech against his troops committing mutiny, he executes 13 of his ringleaders before he confronts his army who are now, committing mutiny after a grueling 10-year campaign where they had felt that they had been dishonored. They have the perception of being dishonored by Alexander the Great. And I'm not certain where that came across, but it was something felt by the majority of their masses. Now, this is how Alexander the Great approaches a situation where if he doesn't approach this carefully, he very well could die. This could easily kill him. What he proceeds to do is he says, go ahead and leave. This is not meant to keep any of you from leaving. That is fine. But before you leave, I want you to be aware of how you've treated me. He proceeds to start off with his father and how his father, King Philip, had taken this small village of people. He not only defeated the barbarians that were imposing their will in a small village. He turned them from slaves to rulers, and through this process, eventually was named the supreme ruler of Greece. And he's like, in it and of itself, what my father did for you guys is more than enough. But it fails in comparison from what you gained from me. Then he proceeds to talk about how they conquered the Peloponnesians, and then they continued to conquer the great king Darius, made his people rulers, conquered all the land, gave them the riches. Then they conquered Egypt. They conquered Crimea, Palestine, Mesopotamia, Babylon, Lydia. And along this, Alexander the Great doesn't keep anything for himself. He's now giving his troops the land. He made them generals. He made them captains. He talks about how they celebrated weddings together. He talks about how many of their kids are going to be cousins to his. He talks about how if you died in battle, if you met a glorious fate in battle, you were sent back home, you were buried with full honors, and then your family was honored and did not pay taxes to the state. He talks about how all of you had collected debts that I had paid off without asking how you collected them, because you pillage every city we take and you're paid well enough. But he still didn't ask how they collected these debts. He just paid them. He explains, I eat what you eat. I get no more sleep than you do. Many nights I've stayed awake on watch that way you all could rest. He also says, he's like, anybody who thinks they've given more to me than I have to them, come up here. Strip down to your bare flesh. For there is not a part of my frontal body that does not bear a scar. I have endured scars from arrows, swords, stones, and clubs. And this was all true, because before he was the supreme general, he was fighting with the army on the front lines. Then, after he gives them this whole speech, he says, perhaps when you go back home, you'll be viewed highly by men, and perhaps the gods will look at you favorably. But go and tell them that you abandoned your leader here, the one who did all of this for you. I have kept nothing to myself. The only thing I have is the land that I hold in trust for you. And then he demands that they all leave. After he makes this demand, his troops are now begging at his feet, apologizing to him, begging for him to accept them again. And he's able to rally all his troops behind him again, and they continue on their forward march. Now, what is the difference here between these two? There's one simple distinction. Despite how similar their situations were, there's one key distinction. And it's that Alexander the Great told a better story. When Alexander the Great was facing a similar situation to Socrates, he called upon the human emotion. He made you feel bad for even daring to put him in this situation. Socrates didn't do this. Socrates just explained why the situation was wrong. And by all accounts, he was right. He was right. He was falsely accused. He hadn't done anything wrong. It was simply because people wanted to remove him from power. And you have to think, if he would have called upon human emotion and explained how much he sacrificed for the people, as opposed to explaining why he was in the right, he would have been able to get those other 12 votes. So that, I can close.
Thank you.